Our country, sweet Mandela, our country, that God gave us this country. That God gave us this country. We are calling on everyone here to come and pray for this country, Liberia, God gave us this country.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a noonday broadcast where we delve into transformative dialogues about social justice and the voices leading the charge for social reforms. Here at a noonday, we explore the intersections of politics, culture, and tradition with the leaders who are reshaping our world for the better. A noonday focuses on critical dialogues around social justice with emphasis on gender justice to influence policies and contribute to societal shifts. My name is Priscilla Jenny Mah-Belloh. Thank you for joining us, everyone. So, we facilitate conversations that challenge our worldviews and lead to the evolution of a new consciousness of ourselves, our relations to each other, and the world in which we all live. Today, on a new day, our guest is Dr. Robtel Pailey. She prefers that I refer to her as Robtel. But yeah, Robtel does not need introduction, people. But for the sake of non-Liberians who are going to be on and they now follow our recent development, Robtel served as the national orator for Liberia Independence Day this year, which was recently celebrated on July 26th. So we invited her on to pick her brain on a little more details because I think the speech itself was detailed. But just in case there are other things so that Robtel can help us understand where she came from with those points. So thank you for joining us today, Robtel. It's good to have you on a new day.
It's my pleasure, Priscilla. Thank you for being so persistent in hounding me down to make sure that we would do this interview. I know you asked if I could do the interview even before the 26th celebration, so I'm the
Yeah.
one who's on.
Yeah. And thank you still for honoring after the 26th celebration. Yeah, just like you said, it was before that, and we didn't even know it was going to turn out the way it did. But yeah, I'm glad that you still agreed to come on. So I am so excited to have you besides myself. And I know a lot of people are looking forward to hearing from you. So I don't know whether we have time for a chit chat because I don't want people to start getting mad with me. So maybe let's just go straight into.
I
Let's
don't
just
mind
go.
chit chat. It's a nice way to warm up.
I know, right? But sometimes, yeah, they'll be like, yeah, let's go to the program. We here to. So okay, yeah. So how is it at your end since the 26th? How have you been doing?
I am wonderful. I
Great.
am grateful to God just for the opportunity to speak to Liberians. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people don't realize that most of what I said has already been articulated in my research, in my public scholarship, in my popular commentary. So there's nothing that I said that was sort of new in terms of my own body of research, body of scholarship, body of work. It was just an amalgam of all the things that I've been thinking about related to Liberia, all the things that I've been feeling, and all the things that I've just wanted to share with the nation in such a public manner. So I'm feeling really great. I'm very pleased with the delivery. I'm pleased with the content of the message. I'm pleased with the feedback that I've been getting, constructive criticism, but praise galore. So I'm in a really, really good place. And I would say that, yeah, it's great. It's good to be alive. It's good to be Liberian.
Great, great, great. Yeah, I agree with you. In one of the spaces I am, the one of the professional spaces I'm in, one of our friends pointed out, I was like, if you've been following Robtel work, most of these points, or like all these points she raised, are what she's been talking about, she's been writing about. So why are people sounding so surprised, like, unless you haven't been following her work? So yeah, he raised that in his space, and I was like, yeah, I've been following her work, so I don't see what's new. And then
Yeah, yeah.
moreover, she has said, I'm going to incite. I'm
And
going to
just the title of the presentation, just the title of the oration, it's a radical agenda for reimagining Liberia. So even if you didn't know me, if you understand those words, radical, reimagining, then that should have given you an inkling as to what kind of message I was going to convey, and the kind of energy and power and force that I was coming in. So I forgive those who don't know me, who are not familiar with my work, but hopefully they are now, and they're curious enough, they have the intellectual curiosity enough to go and read. And that's what I'm hoping has happened, right? So when you write a speech, it's not an academic article, it's not an academic book, it's not even a popular commentary. There's only so much you can say in a speech. But if they are really, really interested in delving deeper into most of what I said, I have a personal website, robtelneajaipailey.com. All of my
Mhm.
writing, all of my published work is on that website. There's an opportunity to go beyond the surface of the oration.
Yeah. Yeah, I think while we were doing preparing ourselves for this, I went ahead and went to all the digging from the past years, things I've been wanting to ask you, including the book since 2021. I bought it and my son and I read it. I dug all of those and talking points and said it to you. I was like, no, girl, let's stick to wow.
We can
The
have
just to leave.
we can have another conversation that just focuses on my scholarly work, because it's
Okay,
rich. There's a lot there to
it
unpack,
is.
there's a lot there to unpick. So for the purposes of this conversation, we'll talk about the oration, but I will allude to things that I've published in the past, because that was a foundation of the
Yeah.
speech itself.
Yeah, yeah. I was like, okay. When you said no, let's stick to the oration. I said, okay, okay. Right, right. What works for
Yeah,
you?
because otherwise we'll be on this conversation
For like
for
six
hours.
hours. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, let's just dive into it then. So since you introduced that whole the concept of um Defiance Day
Mm.
is significant. Let's talk about the historical importance of Liberia's independence and its revolutionary roots. How did this historical acts of Liberia's defiance for independence shape Liberia's identity and destiny?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a lot about that in the speech in the very beginning, and as I was shaping the speech, I've done one other interview, another exclusive interview, and I said that the speech was actually originally an hour and a half, and I'm almost ashamed to say that, because as an academic, as someone who lectures on a regular basis, this is what I do. I give 1 hour lectures, 2 hour lectures, an hour and a half lecture. And I was almost thinking about the speech as if I was delivering a lecture, and then I had to cut it down to it was 10,000 words. I had to cut it down to 5,000 words. So people don't realize that you got the revised cut version of the speech. But I said, I in the beginning, the first 5 or 6 paragraphs was a framing of that sort of historical moment. And I said very clearly that I think sometimes we forget the magnitude of what it means, or what it meant at the time, to be Africa's first Black republic. And this idea, Priscilla, of defiance, because it was a defiant act, it was a revolutionary act to declare independence at a time when no other country in the continent existed. I mean, aside from Haiti, which I reference because I think it's important to remember that part of our Black historical trajectory, that Haiti was the first Black republic in the entire world, right? In sort of the Western hemisphere, in the global South, in the so-called global North. And we were the first Black republic in the global South. But we do owe some sort of homage to Haiti, right? Haiti, is a lot of people know, but Haiti is what people call it in the country. So I wanted to reference that. I also wanted to reference the fact that at the time, and even years later, decades later, our continent was in the midst of colonial expansion. It was in the midst of colonial intervention. And we decided that although the French and the British were encroaching upon Liberia's territory and carved out quite a large portion, a large chunk of Liberia's territory. So the territory that we call Liberia now in the 21st century is smaller than what we started out with. I didn't have a chance to talk about that in the revised shortened version, but all of these things, if you think about them, it's quite powerful. That entry into existence as a nation, that entry into the so-called comity of nations is a very, very powerful history. It's a very, very dynamic history. And I think we forget that, and the sort of self-reflection for me was really important to start the speech with, right? So this idea of independence being in defiance, I thought it was a great way to begin the narrative. And for a very, very long time, for the first 20 years of our existence, slowly but surely, countries started recognizing us because they had no other choice, right? We forget that part of our history as well. And so I wanted to start the speech with that reminder to us as a people that our very foundation is one that we should celebrate, right? Yes, Independence or Indefiance Day is one of celebration. It's also one of reflection and reckoning. But let's start with that celebratory stance that we are who we are because our foremothers and our forefathers stood up for our right to be free and sovereign and Black. The Black experience is very, very, very germane. It's very, very integral to who we are. And I wanted us to remember that. I wanted us to celebrate that. I wanted us to hold that in high regard because I think there's somewhat of an inferiority complex that's crept into the Liberian body politic. It's crept into the psyche of us as a people. And I wanted to remind us that we started on superior grounds. We started on a sort of revolutionary stance to say we are human, we are free, we are sovereign. So yes, that was very important to me. The other thing I wanted to remind people of, although I didn't state it explicitly, is that a lot of people, there's a phrase that a lot of people use, and I think we need to disabuse ourselves. It's a misnomer. Liberia was founded by freed slaves. First of all, that's an oxymoron. You can't be free and enslaved at the same time. So number one, I don't call people who came back as repatriated Blacks slaves. I call them enslaved people because slavery did not define their essence as human beings. They were human beings, but they were enslaved. What was done to them was slavery, right? So I don't call people who were enslaved slaves. That's the first thing. The other thing is Liberia was actually founded by free men and women. And then the repatriates, those who were manumitted and granted their freedom, came a bit later. If you even see the charter of the American Colonization Society, it was to found a space for free Black women and men because they posed a threat to the very institution of slavery, right? So that, again, that defiance of saying we are going to find ourselves a space and a place where not only are we free, but we are self-governed. That is a revolutionary act. So I'm sure people know the history, but I wanted to just remind us of that because I really believe fundamentally that we have forgotten about that 1847 moment as being significant, not only in the history of the continent of Africa, but the Black world, the Black Atlantic writ large.
Okay, yeah. So that's what the whole national reflection was about. 26 national reflection accountability. So since we talk about the need for that national reflection accountability, numerous times that was why you urged us dignity must define us, stressing the importance of dignity as a guiding principle for national identity and citizenship. You over and over said dignity must define us. Can you discuss how these principles should guide Liberian citizenship? Or actually, you were reminding us. So that means we have to reclaim it. We had it. So what specific steps do you believe are necessary to reclaim this dignity?
I think I talked about it a lot in the speech, Priscilla, but just as a reminder to people,
Mm,
it's that idea, going back to that idea of redefining and reconceptualizing citizenship. So it's this idea of citizenship being passive, active, and interactive. And for me, the third part of the citizenship triad that I talked about, which is a part of my scholarly research, is this idea of building relationships, right? So it's not only reclaiming self-worth as an individual, but reclaiming self-worth as a community, reclaiming self-worth as a nation, and then treating each other with civility, treating each other with respect, regardless of your political persuasion, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your race, regardless of your ability, regardless of your class, regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of all these social qualifiers that we are so hung up on. The fact of the matter is, we are human, we are Liberian, we are free, right? So we have to treat each other with the same level of respect that we expect other people to treat us with, right? So we can't point the finger at international actors. We can't point the finger at immigrants in our country and say, oh, they're not treating us well, when we ourselves treat each other with such cruelty, treat each other with just a lack of civility, right? So for me, that's at the very core. Is if you have dignity, there's a certain way you comport yourself, right?
mm,
There's a certain way you hold yourself with your shoulders held high. There's a certain
mm,
way that you behave that doesn't denigrate your person. It doesn't denigrate the other citizen as well, right? So treating each other with respect and dignity, treating each other, treating our country, loving our country, having a sense of patriotism, having a sense of, I have a responsibility to this nation, and as much as this nation has a responsibility to me. So I talked about this fulfilling responsibility as the active, practice-based form of citizenship, paying our taxes, building Liberian capacities, respecting the rule of law, something as simple as that. So if there's a traffic sign, not going through the traffic sign, if there's certain laws that we have to obey, we should be able to do that. That's a form of exhibiting dignity, right? So all of those things for me are part and parcel of this notion of dignity must define us. This reminder that whatever you do in your individual personal capacity, as well as in the capacity that you might work in the public sphere,
mhm,
that there is a responsibility that you have to yourself, but also your fellow citizen and your state. And that refrain, dignity must define us, for me is just a reminder of, when we're doing something in our private lives, is this a dignified way of
wait,
behaving?
mm,
Right? When we're doing something in sort of the public sphere, whether we work for government or we work for the private sector or we work in our own sort of individual capacities, are we behaving in such a way that exhibits a certain level of self-worth, right? But not only individual self-worth, but collective self-worth, right? Are we being accountable to ourselves, and are
mm,
we being accountable to each other? So all of that is a form of dignity must define us. And throughout the speech, you'll notice that I kept repeating it over and over again, but I gave examples of how we can exhibit that at every level, without any sort of, oh, because I'm a minister or because I'm a senator or a member of the House of Representatives, I'm exempt from
yeah,
those. I'm
and it's
exempt from those responsibilities. I'm exempt from those ways of being that might bring us back to a very core of who we are, and that's human beings. So how do we treat each other well? How do we treat each other with kindness, regardless of whether or not we might disagree or we might have different kinds of social qualifiers? So I don't know, that refrain came to me. It came to me quite early on, and I wanted that to be an underlying sort of trend throughout the speech. So you notice that I started repeating it, and then other people in the audience started repeating it. So I'd go back to the audience, and then they would say it, and then I would say it, and it became almost like a chorus. It was actually quite beautiful and lyrical, the way it worked out, and I hadn't planned that in terms of the back and forth, because for me, a
okay.
speech, an oration, is a conversation. And even though there's one person who's standing in front of a large crowd, the fact of the matter is, you're in conversation with your audience. And the more active the audience feels in that conversation, the better. And I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better outcome, to be quite honest with you.
Okay. All right. So yes, well, you said you didn't have, when we started, you said it was like an hour and a half, the speech that I wanted to give, but then because of the program and protocol, they gave you a specific time to work in. So there are some of the points that you didn't have the time to raise. So
Sure.
now is the, yeah, so you have the chance now to let us know. And one of the points was, there are a few of them, but let's start with media accountability.
Mm,
Could you, yeah, the media. I used to be an active part of the media, and I still try to do that on this platform. We proudly say we're the watchdog.
mm.
So we always used to, yeah. So elders will say,
Yeah.
watches the watchdog. So could you elaborate on your views regarding media accountability in
Sure.
Liberia and why it's crucial for our democracy? Like how can
Sure.
the media play a more responsible role in shaping public opinion and holding power to account?
Sure. I think one of the ways that the media, and it's funny because in the last interview I did, the interviewer did say or reminded me that I mentioned Kato, which is something you might be familiar with, where
Yeah, I thought you
media.
kept saying Bado. So I said, she even know how to say
No, no, no,
Kato.
Kato, Kato, Kato. Maybe I probably spelled it correctly, but
K-A-T-O,
it's
yeah.
this thing where the like a media institution might ask an entity to give them small thing, or effectively it's a bribe, right? Give me a bribe and I will publish your press release as it is, or I'll publish your story as it is. Just send me the story and I'll publish it as is. And for me, that economic model just doesn't work, because then the public just doesn't respect what the media does and says, because they are for sale essentially, right? And they are. A lot of media institutions, who shall remain nameless, are for sale, and they are in the business of sensationalizing the news. They're in the business of basically tabloid stuff, right? So gossip. A lot of unsubstantiated things get published in a lot of our media institutions. Some of them are leading, and I wonder how they got to be leading. So there's very little kind of investigative, hard-hitting news reportage that's not just press release being published, press release being repeated over and over again by different institutions that have vested interests, right? So one of the ways that the media can be accountable is just publishing the truth. I mean, going and doing the investigation. I'm a researcher. Before I believe anything that somebody has said, I want evidence. So I'd like to see the media in Liberia gather the evidence, do the analysis,
Exactly.
go back to the sort of principles that you
Analysis
learned.
is my
Yeah,
issues.
go back to the
Analyze at
principles.
least.
Go back to the principles that you learned in journalism school. That idea of autonomy and independence, presenting all sides of the story, not slanting it because that person may have given you cateau. And then there's such an awesome responsibility. I think that a lot of media institutions forget that they are supposed to present the facts as they know it, right? They're also supposed to inform the public. There's such a huge kind of responsibility. Go back to that Liberian citizenship triad that I talked about, that awesome responsibility of informing the public so that they can then make informed decisions, right? I think a lot of media institutions don't realize the power, the kind of the sort of real, the magnitude of what they can do when they are accountable to the craft of journalism, when they are accountable to their sort of media ethics. So yeah, that Gato things has got to go. And I know, the economic model of a lot of media institutions, unfortunately, they can't pay their journalists very well, and the journalists haven't been trained. But we need to go back to, how do you train journalists in such a way that they can do more hard-hitting investigative stuff? How do you train journalists in such a way that they're running after stories that are of human interest, right? They're of the public interest, right? Following the money, following the story in such a way that you are digging deeper beyond the surface of what institutions, again, that have a vested interest want you to report. I would like to see more of that. And that's how the media can regain its level of respect in the country. Because right now, I can say for free that I don't respect a lot of media institutions in Liberia. I mean, for me, it was so disappointing, and I don't want to go off too much on this tangent, but it was so disappointing to see how media institutions even reported my national oration, right? They decided to focus on a particular distraction that happened during the oration, forgetting that there were 5,000 words worth of important stuff, historical just heavy stuff that we need to grapple with as a nation. And they decided to go wayward, go rogue, and focus on one element of the speech that was 4 or 5 lines, right? We all know what this is talking about, right? The theatrics that they decided to focus on. So if that's what media does, then I'm quite wary about giving them the level of respect that they think that they deserve, right? So there was so much that I said in the speech that could have been reported on, right? This changing the minimum wage from 143 to 250. I thought the media was going to run with that. The War and Economic Crimes Court. I thought the media was going to run with that. I talked about, investing in creative industries and not extractive industries. I thought the media was going to run with that. I gave a clarion call to different private sector institutions to pick up the heaps of trash in the country. I thought the media was going to run with that. There were so many things that I said during this particular speech that I thought the media was going to delve into. And now I'm not going to say that all media institutions were poor in their reportage. There were some that, after they realized that the theatrics were not the center of my speech, then they started focusing on the fact that I had a bold economic plan, a new kind of bold economic plan for Liberia. And then there were some media institutions that picked up on that. There were some media institutions that talked about accountability, right? They picked up on that and they ran with stories on that. So I've seen probably in the past, maybe 1 week or so, media institutions going back to the job at hand and actually doing the kind of hard-hitting investigative work that is required, not only of my speech, but what's happening in the country, as it were, today.
Yeah, just to name a few. So by July 29, I share this. I'm posting these newspapers on my Facebook because in my journalistic judgment, they focus on what I will focus on. Newspapers say the headline says jail corrupt officials, and then they have your picture there.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, just
Yeah,
like you
I mean,
said.
one of the things that I did focus on, sorry, Priscilla, to cut you off. One of the things that I did focus on, and there was a huge section on that, was this idea of a values-based revolution, right? Changing our value system. And that's a long-term process, right? Do we value accumulating vast amounts of wealth through hook and crook, right? Or do we value integrity? Do we value hard work? Do we value respecting each other, treating each other with civility, right? I talked about this values-based revolution. So I'm glad that some of the media institutions did pick up on my prescription for how do you tackle corruption? How do you tackle graft? Not only in the public sector, but also in our everyday human interactions.
Yeah. In the Inquirer newspaper, headline was Independence Day Orator unpacked Liberia's on freedom. So a
Okay,
few
great.
of them, I just shared it on my Facebook. I said, these are the
Great.
newspapers I will elevate. So,
Fantastic.
but I agree with you. Like, I don't want to send people news judgment when it comes to determining what is the news.
Sure.
Well, thank
No,
you.
I
Thank
mean,
you.
for me, because I've worked as a journalist before, right? A lot of people don't realize that I spent a whole year working as a journalist in Washington, D.C. And
Okay.
I get it. Newspapers have to sell, right? So the sort of clickbait, the more sensational, the more you sell. But let's not forget about the fact that the core of journalism is to report facts,
Yeah.
to report, to dig deeper beyond the
Yeah.
surface and to talk about what the public needs to know in order to make informed decisions. For me, that's the
Decision.
responsibility of the media, right? You can still sell newspapers and do it responsibly. You
Yeah, I'm
don't
just
have to.
talking about headlining, what not supposed to be, like making front page and back page. What is not the main issue of the oration? That's where,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree with you. That if you want to carry the theatrics, you can, but you making that headline, it's like really the
And
entire
it's also a
speech.
disservice to the country. It's a
Mhm.
disservice to the nation because a lot of people were not opportune to listen to the speech. A lot of people were not opportune to read the speech. And I know that there's, different levels of literacy in Liberia. So I would have expected the media to say, let's break down the speech for the common
Mhm.
person.
Yeah.
Robtel is a scholar, so some of the language she uses is a bit elevated. So let's break it down for the common person so they can understand. And I'm fully aware of that.
Well, let
although
me
I
just.
will say, Priscilla, I had an encounter that was quite interesting. So I went to an ambassador. One of the ambassadors invited me for a luncheon at his place, and we had lunch with a number of different ambassadors, and a few Liberians were invited as well. But I that was nice. I mean, it was a nice gesture. But you know what really got to me when I walked outside? This was the day after the oration. When I walked outside, there was a security guard in the compound, in the ambassador's compound, who ran up to me. It's like he saw me from almost, I don't know how many meters away, and said, "Ma, thank you. You spoke for us. You spoke for the real Liberian people, the common Liberian person. Thank
Glad
you so much." He couldn't stop thanking me. He wanted a picture with me because, as far as he was concerned, I spoke truth to power. I was given an opportunity and I seized it, not for self-aggrandizement, but to talk for those, and I don't say voiceless, because there's a scholar by the name, or an activist author by the name of Arundhati Roy. She's
everyone,
Indian, and she
right?
says
Yeah,
there's no such thing as the voiceless. There's
voiceless,
only the deliberately silenced and the preferably
silence,
unheard.
or
So as
ignored.
far as I
Yeah,
was concerned, I was speaking for not the voiceless, because they're not voiceless. They're deliberately silenced or preferably unheard. And when that security guard came up to me and said, "Thank you, Ma," as far as I was concerned, Priscilla, my work was done.
voice. Mm-hmm.
It was done, because I wasn't
Yeah,
talking for the elites. I was speaking for the common person who doesn't have the opportunity to speak truth to power in the face of the elites, right? So whatever anybody else has to say about me, they can talk. And you know what I do? I just wipe it off my shoulder, wipe it off another shoulder, and I keep it moving, because that's how I've been doing my entire life, right? I have been speaking truth to power. That is my life purpose. And I
yeah,
think that's what God put me on this earth to do. And there's an awesome responsibility in that, because when you speak truth to power, people will not like it. But
no,
you know what? The more dislike, the more I feel like I fulfilled my purpose, because
mhm,
when you speak truth to power, the people who are in power, who want to maintain the status quo, they will get very, very upset, very,
yeah.
very upset. That is not my concern. I don't care. Is what I want to say to those people.
Yeah, just to let you know, talking about breaking it down for in simple, Dennis recently said to me, when after I told him I was expecting you and then a flyer, he said, okay, then I'll wait after Robtel, then I want to break the oration down into simple Liberian English. So I think that's his next project
And
after
that's great.
your
I
film.
think that's fantastic. I'm happy to hear that. I've already been in
Yeah,
conversation with ELBC as well. So if Dennis is going to do it, fantastic. The more people we have doing it, the better. And a breakdown line by line, so that it's very, very clear. So ELBC, I'm in conversation with ELBC to do something similar on the radio, right? To get a simple English professional to do the narration line by line and explain it in Liberian English, because that's our lingua franca. Uh,
Mhm.
and people think, oh, she went and she spoke on 26 and that's the end of it. They don't realize I have plans. I've already started, the work of moving beyond just the speech itself, moving beyond that moment on the 26th itself, because I think that there was something very powerful about that moment that I want to make sure that we don't lose, we don't forget. And there are also very concrete recommendations that I made that I think we have to ensure those recommendations are taken up, and whether they're taken up by the powers that be and implemented or not. But I'd like to see the public make a concerted effort to hold our duty bearers' feet to the fire, to say there's certain things that I recommended that I think we should be pursuing, that we should be pushing forward. There are a couple of other things that I mentioned that I didn't have a chance to include in the
I was
shortened
coming
version of
to
the speech. You were coming to that, yeah.
Yeah, I was
Is
coming to the next one is the legislative boundaries. You mentioned that the legislature should. Oh no, this one you went into a. Let's talk about the judicial independence,
Sure, sure,
integrity. So
sure.
ensuring judicial independence and the importance of integrating legal ethics into law school curricula. How can Liberia ensure the judiciary remains autonomous and free from
Yeah.
external pressures? That's one of my questions. The other one is, um, how can we you highlighted, so I already mentioned, what reforms will you suggest to strengthen this aspect of legal training,
Mm.
incorporating legal ethics as a cornerstone of law school education?
Sure, sure. So the I feel like the judiciary got a bit of a they got a bit of an exemption in the speech, although I did say that President Boakai should appoint impartial patriots, not only in the judiciary at the Supreme Court level and also at, lower than the Supreme Court, but also in our integrity institutions. But there was a whole section on the judiciary that I had in the speech that was eventually cut. So one of the ways that I think would help is all of our judges, including the Supreme Court bench, are appointed by the head of state. And I think that needs to fundamentally change. There are models on the continent of Africa, and I even shared this with our Chief Justice the morning after the speech, and she said she's aware of those models and she fully supports my suggestion, where you have an independent body of legal scholars, legal practitioners who actually are responsible for appointing the Supreme Court justices, and then also appointing all justices in the country, right? I don't think the head of state should be I don't think the head of state should make that sort of unilateral decision, because what it does is it effectively creates a sort of conflict of interest where these judges, where the Supreme Court justices then owe some sort of fealty to the head of state, so that the head of state can decide, make up some outrageous claims or make up some sort of outrageous policies. And if he or she is challenged on that, and that goes straight to the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court becomes beholden to that head of state. So there's a lack of independence, there's a lack of autonomy amongst those who work in the judiciary. And we've seen this happen. So we've seen this happen during electoral disputes, where the NEC has done, has allegedly engaged in irregularities, or has allegedly condoned irregularities. And there have been candidates who've gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has basically turned down their appeals. And if you have a head of state who has a vested interest in remaining in power, and that person is an incumbent, of course, they're going to wield a certain level of control over the Supreme Court to make a judgment in their behalf. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that model. We need to change it. I don't know how we change it. The Governance Commission, I think, has made some suggestions about how do we make our judiciary more autonomous. And the reason I didn't delve deeper into the judiciary is because I focused on our elected body. So you'll notice that I spoke directly to the president in terms of the mistakes that he's made. I spoke to the legislature directly in terms of the mistakes that they made and how they needed to course correct. Because these two bodies, these two institutions, are institutions or branches of government that are elected effectively, right? Of course, the president and the vice president they have appointing kind of powers, but the executive is elected as well as the legislature is elected. The judiciary is not elected. And so my point in some ways, neglecting to speak to them directly is because they are not elected by the people. I believe fundamentally that even though they can't be elected, they can be appointed by a representative body of the people, right? So that's one of the ways to minimize interference by the executive, interference by the legislature in the third branch of government, because the whole point of having three branches of government is that you want checks and balances. Now, how can you have checks and balances when the judiciary is beholden to the executive? There is no way that they can maintain a certain level of autonomy and independence when they're appointed by the executive themselves, right? So I think that's one of the ways to do it. In terms of legal ethics, I know there have been a lot of issues with the Lewis Arthur Grimes School of Law, where people have forged their grades, and there's been so much controversy in terms of reportage and people being allowed to graduate when they actually falsified their documents or they falsified their grades. I think the Lewis Arthur Grimes School of Law needs to be completely overhauled, and that starts with the dean of the Lewis Arthur Grimes School of Law. I know of a number of people who've graduated from that law school and have stated to me that it is not producing the best and highest level of legal education. I would like to see the Lewis Arthur Grimes School of Law not hold a monopoly on training our legal practitioners. I would like to see another school of law come to give them a little bit of competition so that they can whip into shape, because I think the Lewis Arthur Grimes School of Law is not fit for purpose. I think it needs to be completely overhauled, completely reconfigured, completely reformed, so that we are producing legal practitioners who understand legal ethics, who understand how do you comport yourself as a representative of the law, as someone who is supposed to dispense justice without fear or favor. represent the truth, and let justice all. So there's a lot of politicking when it comes to the legal practitioner in Liberia. There's a lot of wheeling and dealing when it comes to the legal practitioner in Liberia. And I'm just concerned that those people who don't have money, those people who don't have a certain level of stature, are being completely neglected. And I think that the legal profession in Liberia needs to have its own reckoning, needs to have its own self-reflection. But I think part of doing that, shaking the system up, is providing a little bit more competition to the Lewis Arthur Grimes School of Law. I think they have too much of a monopoly. But I understand that there is a legal ethics course that a friend of mine, Eva Mappy Morgan, does teach, but I don't know what's happening in terms of after people graduate. I think that they're going into a profession that does not appreciate the truth, does not appreciate that idea of balance, that does not appreciate the ideal of representation. So that's one of the ways, and I know of a few people who've told me that they're actually establishing another law school. So I was happy
Great,
to hear that.
great.
I was happy to hear that, and hopefully they'll come on and talk about this competition that they're going to give the Lewis Arthur Grimes School a run for its money. But I hope they don't slip into the same kind of pattern that the Lewis Arthur Grimes School of Law has slipped into, unfortunately, because I understand from a number of Liberian legal practitioners in the past, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, it was the place to be. I mean, it produced some of the most sharp, or the sharpest legal minds. It produced some of the most important kind of human rights defenders. That was its modus operandi, and I think it's lost. It's lost that kind of
I
edge,
agree.
and it needs to get back to that. Right? Dignity must
Yeah,
define us in the legal perfection.
yeah, yeah. I agree with and the part about another school needs to be established. Another they need competition, or another law school either needs to be established, or they need to get back to where it used to be. uh, because I was so it affected me. Let's say I take things hard.
Mm.
So there's like for a month or two, I was depressed when I got denied, and it was based on merit. Believe me.
I've heard that where
Uh,
people are just passing the law school exam and they clearly
I
have
know.
not passed.
Yeah, yeah. Mine was yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, there
Yeah.
was
The
somebody
other
there
thing.
that they said you had to see them, and I heard in recent times that that person was removed. And I'm like, okay, but yeah, there were two of us, and the other person went through, and I did not because of that. I'm not going to agree to giving something.
Mm.
So yeah, I
Yeah, I mean
agree.
the other thing about the legal profession is I don't know if you've actually sought representation from Liberian lawyers. And I don't want to give all Liberian lawyers a bad rep, because some of them are reputable. Some of them are actually really responsible legal practitioners. So let me just
Oh
state
yeah,
that categorically so that I don't get attacked for attacking the legal profession in Liberia. But I think overall we need a systems change, right? What
yeah.
I will say is I have read things that have been written by people who say that they've graduated from Lewis Arthur Grimes School of Law, and I've actually been quite appalled. So let's,
Okay.
in terms of the training, I'm very, very appalled by what's being produced.
For me, it was yeah. I didn't get into it. It was right at the gate. There are some gatekeepers that keep it for maybe they have their own term. It's not Kato, it's something else. But yeah, that's how I end up going to the MPA program.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was the law school that I tried first. So let's go to those that were elected.
Mm.
You talk about legislative boundaries. You mentioned that the legislature should not be responsible for paying people's school fees, hospital bills, etc. And you explain how these demands perpetuate a system of patronage and dependency. So, what
Yeah.
must legislators do to prevent the perpetuation of patronage and dependency?
Yeah.
Or do you think? Sorry,
No, go
uh,
ahead, finish the question.
I was going to say, do you think, because I think it was the public actually you were talking to, not legislature,
Yeah.
but did you also talk to them? Because I want to say, do you think the public, it is the public that needs to be educated on legislative responsibility so that they shift, so that we have a shift in public expectations of legislature, emphasizing the role of legislature is policy making rather than personal financial support. So then what
Yeah.
steps will be taken to educate the public on elected official proper responsibilities and roles?
Sure. I mean, it's sort of a vicious circle, isn't it? Because I did talk to a number of legislators after the event, and I told them I actually had a whole section on where I was talking to the citizenry about the undue expectations that they have of those people they elect, right? So, and they said, yes, you should have included that in the speech. You should not have removed it. So I'm glad that you're bringing it up, Priscilla, because I think the public needs to be educated if they don't already know. Your legislators are not people who pay your school fees. Your legislators are not people to pay your hospital bills. Your legislators are not people who are supposed to build your house. That is not their function. That is not their responsibility. And I said this in the speech, that they have an oversight function that, again, that checks and balances between the legislature and the executive and the judiciary, right? Oversight to make sure that there's accountability of the executive, right, and the accountability of the judiciary through the appointment process and a number of other processes, right? Lawmaking. And then lawmaking, that is their only function. They are not there to take care of social, the legislators are not there to take care of basic social services. That is not their responsibility. They can pass laws that ensure you have the roads that you need. They can pass laws to ensure that you have the hospitals that you need. They can pass laws to ensure that you have the education sector that's fit for purpose. But their responsibility is not to pay for your children's school fees. Their responsibility is not to pay for your children's or for your healthcare bills. Their responsibility is not to build roads. And I think, unfortunately, members of the legislature themselves don't understand their function. And as a result of that, it creates dysfunction where there's this undue expectation that the citizenry have of their elected duty bearers. And then what the legislature will do, or legislators will do, in order to be reelected, or in order to ensure that they are reelected, then they start focusing on scholarships. They start focusing on healthcare. They start focusing on building roads. That is not their function. So I think it's important for the public to recognize that. And this is why it becomes a problem when people who should be in elected office, i.e. women, I'm a big proponent of women because I'm a feminist through and through, women who have integrity, women who have the competence to run for office, have a very, very difficult time, right? Because there are all of these undue expectations that we as the electorate place on these people, right? Oh, you got to buy me a bag of rice in order for me to secure a vote for you. Oh, you have to do this for me. Oh, you have to do this for me. No, that should not be how we electioneer. You know, we have to figure out an electoral process or an electoral system that doesn't place all of these undue burdens. And then what happens, I'm not condoning their behavior, is the legislators then start going into some sort of dubious behavior, right? Where they're always expecting this brown paper bag in order to go back to their elected, the people who elect them as their constituents, to fulfill these responsibilities that are actually not within that's actually not within their mandate, right? So again, it's a sort of vicious circle that goes on and on and on and on. So I want to say categorically, Liberians, do not place undue pressure on the legislators to do things that are outside of their mandate. Their mandate is to provide oversight, so that there are checks and balances between their power and the power of the executive, the power of the judiciary, and they're there to make laws. So if you're interested in ensuring that you have functioning health systems, functioning education systems, roads, infrastructure, tell them to pass laws that will enable you to have that in your different districts, in your different counties. That's how you hold them accountable, right? That's what they're supposed to do. That is their responsibility. So for me, and maybe the legislators whom I spoke to were right, that I should have included that in the speech, but I'm saying it now. So hopefully people remember and they watch this and they take to heart what I'm saying, because it becomes quite difficult for people who don't have the resources to spend, to throw cash at the electorate to say, vote for me because I'll give you a bag of rice. But those people that you're not voting for because they haven't given you a bag of rice are probably going to be the best representatives for you. They are going to have your best interest at heart. It's not because they give you a bag of rice that means that they have your best interest at heart. They're trying to bribe you with your vote. So if we take our responsibility seriously as members of the electorate, then we'll be looking for something different beyond the bag of rice. beyond
Yeah.
the cash that gets flowing throughout the electoral process.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because when I wrote this question, I like, how can the legislature, what must legislature do to prevent the perpetuation of this? Then I'm like,
Well,
wait,
I
maybe
think
it's the citizens that we need to educate, but then how do we educate them so that they shift their expectations? But Robtel, do you think it
I
also
think
has to do with the fact that legislature overpaid themselves?
well,
So
that's a part of it. And I think perhaps, and I'm playing I always tell
so
my
it's like
students,
the
and
egg and the chicken, right?
well, that's it. That's why it says a vicious circle. And I tell
Yeah.
my students this, and they always laugh. I always tell them I don't believe in the devil, so I don't play devil's advocate. I always play
Yeah.
angel's advocate, right? So how do you look at this from a different perspective? Is I think sometimes because the pressures are so intense for
Mm.
legislators, and because people come to their offices every single day asking for things, then what they do in turn is they say increase our salary so that we can provide for the electorate in a way that's meaningful for them, right? That this is what they're asking us for. These are the demands that they place on us, on our resources. So I'm playing angel's advocate and saying perhaps this is one of the reasons why the legislator is always asking for a huge chunk of the national budget, because they have these demands placed on them by the electorate that are unfair, to be quite honest with you, unfair, right? And I think what citizens need to do is to recognize that. So that's a part of it. I think another part of it is some legislators, because not all of them are genuine, some legislators actually want the system of patronage to continue, right? They want the system of patronage where then the electorate becomes beholden to them for all of these basic social services, where they can take advantage of that patronage system. And then, because think about it, if your electorate is independent, if they're not relying on you for resources, they're going to make
They
very
can make
independent
a
decisions about who they
exactly.
vote for, who they elect. They're not going to be thinking, oh, that person gave me a bag of rice, therefore I must vote for them. They're going to say, oh, I have my own bag of rice that I've been able to provide for myself, and I'm going to vote my conscience, right? So I think some legislators appreciate, they want to perpetuate this system of patronage. They want to perpetuate this system of dependency because it enables them to reproduce themselves, right? I call them political entrepreneurs. These are the people who make politics a business, right? This sort of give and take. And I think once we get rid of that patronage system, people will be able to vote their conscience, and the legislators won't have the same kind of power over the citizenry. They won't have the same kind of control over the citizenry. The citizenry will have significant amounts of more autonomy, right? And they'll be able to make decisions that are based on their own basic self-interests, right? So I think it's both the responsibility of the legislators to behave in a way that they are fulfilling their mandates, but it's also the responsibility of the electorate to understand the function of the legislators and to make demands on them that are based on that oversight and lawmaking responsibility that they have. So it goes both ways. And that education must be twofold on the part of the legislators, but then also on the part of the citizenry.
Okay. All right, so let's come to violence against women and
Mm,
girls. Violence against women and girls, we all know is a pervasive issue in Liberia. Well, on noon day started like was it 2020 2021? We went almost a year on the issue of SGBV and GBV. So let's
mm,
talk about addressing and preventing violence against women and girls through cultural change, policy reforms, societal norms that, and may I add, religious practices that
mm.
that in Christianity say the woman is less than the man, and I think in Islam the same thing. They all believe they have the male God who say men are the head. So this allow violence against women and girls to persist, and the importance of legal and social reforms to protect them. How can we address the cultural and systemic factors that tacitly allow such violence? What specific
Yeah,
and we have a lot of policy,
yeah.
but I don't know. And then recently in recent years, maybe it used to happen. It did happen, but now because of social media and people are becoming emboldened to report some of these things, so we have the issue of pedophilia.
Mm.
So what specific program would you recommend to combat that in rape and domestic violence in Liberia?
Well, I would say I think it's the physical violence, but it's also the structural violence. So that the laws, the institutions, the rules, the regulations, even the norms that perpetuate injustice and inequality between men and women, boys and girls, right? So I talked a lot about that during my speech. This idea of structural violence. I think patriarchy, misogyny are at the very, very foundation of that. Liberia is an incredibly patriarchal society. It's incredibly misogynistic, and there's a whole literature, scholarly literature, on something called misogynoir, and that phrase basically means hatred of Black women, right? So I see a lot of misogynoir in Liberia. I mean, I even experienced it after the speech, where I found it very interesting that the vast majority of people who were attacking me for the theatrics that occurred during the national oration were men. Many of them were political entrepreneurs. Many of them were using the occasion to score very cheap political points to gain relevance. And the kind of vitriol, the kind of misogynoir that I've seen in social media posts that people have shared with me has been really appalling, right? So that's one example that I have been sort of receiving at the receiving end of. Shame on you, Liberian men. Shame on you, right? Shame on you, right? That misogynoir that's at the very base of who we are and what we condone in terms of structural violence against women and girls, as well as the sort of physical violence against women and girls. And we saw that come out during the war and even the aftermath of war, where babies are being raped, where young teenagers are being raped, where women are being raped with impunity. And I'll say this to our leaders, right? Those who are in the House, the Senate, and the executive, even the judiciary, where men particularly will play on the fact that there's so much poverty in Liberia, and they will use that to exploit young women, to exploit girls, to exploit women for their own very, very terrible, terrible advantages, right? So I think it's at all levels. And the very foundation of that is patriarchy. The very foundation of that is misogynoir. Now, in terms of policies, so something as simple as the rape law, right? We've got probably one of the most progressive rape laws. And a lot of that can be attributed to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and the women activists, the women warriors who pushed for such a comprehensive rape law, right? At one point, I think rape was a non-bailable offense. I don't know what the status is on that right now, but we've got an SGBV court, I believe, that was established. Correct me if I'm wrong. We've also got a unit for SGBV in the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs. I think that's a new name for the women of the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs, right? So I think let's start with, if we haven't changed that rape is a non-bailable offense, I think we need to go back to that. So that's an example of a law that the legislature can pass to say rape becomes a non-bailable offense because it's become an epidemic. It's a pandemic. That kind of violence against women, sexual violence against women and girls is a pandemic. And so even if it's an executive order for a year that will keep passing until the rates of rape against women and girls goes down, and that's something that we have to do at the executive level, at the legislative level. There are a number of other laws on the books in terms of looking at structural violence. So we passed a Land Rights Act in 2018 that says customary law must recognize women's access to land, and not only access to land, but ownership of land. For me, that's a form of structural violence, where you tell a woman or a young woman that she can't inherit land from her father, right? And this is in customary law. It's encased in customary law. For me, that's a form of structural violence, right? So how do we ensure that the laws, the rules, the norms, the regulations that we have in our country are not structurally violent, are not misogynistic, are not patriarchal, and do not place women and girls in a second tier of citizenship, right? That they are part and parcel of the citizenship triad that I talked about, and therefore their rights must be respected as a consequence of that, right? So I think, I don't know all the laws kind of off the top of my head, but those are some of the examples that I would pull from my knowledge base. And I'm sure the women activists, the women rights warriors can talk more and more about the sorry state of affairs when it comes to violence, structural as well as physical violence against women and girls. I would like to see more women in the legislature. That's one of the ways that we can change systems and make them more amenable, so that women and girls have a stake in every single process, the political, the economic, and social within the context of Liberia. And I would say not just electing women for the sake of electing women, but electing women first and foremost who are going to ensure that women's rights are at front and center, who have a sort of feminist mindset, so that the rights of women and men are the rights of women primarily are respected in Liberia. So one of the ways of doing that, I mean, I think the last elections we had, there were so few women who were elected into the House and the Senate. When we start changing the makeup, right, the gender makeup of our legislative body, when we start changing the gender makeup of our executive body, when we start changing the gender makeup of our judiciary body, then I think a lot of systems will change, that our laws and our policies will change, because at the end of the day, women also need to be part and parcel of the decision-making process. And not just any women, because there's some women who serve the purpose of patriarchy, right? So women who have a feminist mindset, women who are activists through and through, who see women's place in society as equally as important, if not more important than men. I would like to see those women elected. So that's some of the ways that we change it. And I mentioned it kind of in passing, but this idea of ensuring that if you're thinking about elected office, ensuring that campaign finance regulation is front and center, right? Because people will get money by any means necessary. They'll get money from very dubious sources, private donations, but they'll also get money by using state resources to fund campaigns. If we regulate our campaign financing, right, that's one of the ways to ensure that women and, young women, older women are able to run successful campaigns. To her credit, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has that Amuje program. She's also established a fund to ensure that women are able to raise funding and financing for running successful campaigns. A lot of other women's rights organizations have started to front candidates. I would go even to the political parties. There was a bill, I think, that was advanced for ensuring that, in fact, I think it's now part of the electoral law, that basically says political parties should have at least, or should endeavor to ensure that they have at least 30% representation at the upper echelons of the hierarchy of their political parties. So are women standard bearers of political parties, for instance? Are they vice standard bearers of political parties, right? That's one of the ways of changing systems such that patriarchy doesn't prevail within our political sphere.
Yeah. Okay. So now that you touch on the structural aspect of violence, structural poverty to is structural, and then inequality is structural. If you were to talk about collaborative efforts between the government and civil society, how should such collaboration look like? I don't know whether you mentioned something like that and I missed it.
No, I didn't talk very much about, I mean, I spoke generally about Liberians. I mentioned the civil society when I was referencing the president's selection of the office, the head of the executive director of the Office of War and Economic Crimes. And I
But
said
now
that there
I'm
was
talking.
very little.
Okay, but now I'm talking about in case of, in an instance of creating a safer environment for women and girls, and in providing comprehensive support for victims of violence. I think the civil society, whether you mention it or maybe I imagine it, or it's always been how I work, that the civil society and government should collaborate. So I was thinking whether you had an idea as to how such collaboration will look, so that we can be able to just shift society to protect and empower women and girls better.
Sure. I think one of the ways that civil society, particularly women's rights organizations, I would say specifically, can be more involved in collaborating with government bodies is we've got a Ministry of Women and Priscilla, if I'm saying it incorrectly, because I know they changed it from the Ministry of Gender to the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs or something like that. Women, Children, and Social Affairs. Somebody can Google it for me. Sometimes, I always tell students
I know
when
it
they start
as
laughing.
Ministry of Gender. I didn't know.
They've changed it. It's been changed. The name, the nomenclature has changed a little bit. Maybe.
To not even
No,
know.
it's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
And
There
you
are
and
lots
I,
of things.
I don't touch it, probably.
No. I know that it was changed, and I think it's either the Ministry of Women, Children, and Social Affairs or something like that. It's more aligned with a lot of ministries in the continent of Africa. So it's not just about women, right? It's about gender. So and someone can Google that if they want to put it in one of the comments, because it escapes me at the moment. But I think the Ministry of whatever that ministry is called, should be an interface for women's rights organizations to work with, right? So if there are laws or policies that they think would be important for pushing in terms of pushing the agenda, then I think working with the ministry, that ministry, is key, right? I think another thing that would be important is to figure out, civil society also has a responsibility to figure out who in the legislature are allies, right? And I can tell you there are 3 or 4 women in the legislature whom I think of as allies on this particular front, right? Have conversations with them about what particular laws would be gender friendly or are gender mainstreamed such that the rights of women are front and center. I would say that's one way to begin, right? I think the other thing that I was quite disappointed with, and I haven't seen all the appointments, but I found that a lot of the appointments by President Boykai were men. And I was disappointed in that because I expected to see more women at the very, very top. So at the ministerial level, I expected to see more women. At the deputy ministerial level, I expected to see more women. At the state-owned enterprises level, in terms of the heads of state-owned enterprises, I expected to see more women. This is a clarion call for President Boykai to think about who are the women who are leaders in the spheres of influence that are really, really important. Bring them in, right? Bring them into the fore. Even if you're not appointing them, consult them on a regular basis. I saw when they were putting together consultations for the arrest agenda, they did have a consultation with women. I would like to see this consultation happen on a regular basis, not a one-off kind of consultation where you are swooping in, having a conversation with women and men, or women and girls, and then forgetting about them in the long run. So I'd like to see that consultation process be regular, whether it's a quarterly thing, whether it's, every 6 months. So there are different ways that civil society can hold government's feet to the fire. There are different ways in which government can say, civil society is part and parcel of the policymaking process. Therefore, we need to consult with them. But it has to be a two-way street. And the only way to think about it as a two-way street is to see that we respect the wishes of civil society. And civil society also needs to understand that there are certain responsibilities that government has to fulfill. How do you get in there? How do you make yourself relevant? That's also really important, right? So we're not going to sit back as civil society and expect the government to come and consult us. We have to make ourselves relevant. We have to make ourselves visible. We have to make ourselves known. We have to make ourselves heard. Remember, there's no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. And I think in some cases, sometimes women are their worst enemy, right? Sometimes we make ourselves deliberately unheard and preferably silenced. So the onus is on both ends. It's on civil society to make itself relevant, to make itself visible, to make itself heard. And then the onus is on the policymakers to ensure that the consultation process is genuine, that it's not just a box ticking exercise, because quite often it becomes that, right? We'll just take your views. We've done it. We've ticked our boxes and we're moving on. I'd like to see it be more generative, happen more regularly, and it be a genuine process of, we think that you have something to contribute, civil society. I would like to see that happen more often and more regularly.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Robtel. Ooh, the comments are so many. I'm not going to go there. Yeah.
It's okay if you pick up
There
on
was
some
so
of them.
many. Yeah, but let me just finish.
Are they agreeing with me or disagreeing with me? That's all I want to know.
Yeah, we'll get to it. Just
Okay.
instead of one, culture and symbolic revision. So the potential impact. Let's talk about the potential impact of cultural and symbolic revision on our national identity. Why are you joining others who have? And I know I used to be one of the persons talking about. Especially my problem always used to be on the temple of just how do you call it?
Let
Okay,
justice be
let
done to
justice
all
be
men.
done
But
to
they
all
moved
men.
it.
I feel like,
They moved
okay,
the
good.
men.
You
Yeah, they
see,
did.
okay, good.
And that
So
was during our time, between 2000, I think between 2007 and 2012, that was changed.
okay, good. Okay, great, 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 great. So but just for the public's sake, let us know why do you propose adopting new national symbols, and how will this impact national identity, and also explain the rationale of adopting a widely spoken national language and embracing Liberian English as a lingua franca.
Sure. So I'm of the belief that culture is something that is fluid. Can you hear me? Because I'm
Yeah.
hearing a little bit of feedback. Okay.
Oh no,
I'm,
I
I'm
mean,
I'm of the belief that culture is something that is fluid and not fixed. So culture is always evolving. It's not something that existed in 1847 and is frozen in time. It's fluid. It's constantly evolving because we as a human race, we as Liberians, we are constantly evolving. And so our cultural norms, the things that we hold dear as cultural kind of artifacts, also have to change. They have to be fluid and not fixed, right? So I think our foremothers and fathers, and someone picked up on this as well. They're like, I wonder if this girl is a feminist. And I am. I claim that as a part of my identity, right? So you'll notice in the speech, I always talked about women before men. I say our foremothers and our forefathers.
yeah, me
Our
too. I do that.
our foremothers and our forefathers, um, at the time in 1847 had a certain sensibility. They had a certain mindset, but we are 177 years old. So the symbols of the past are no longer relevant. They do not serve a particular purpose. They do not serve the purpose of dignity, as far as I'm concerned, because they have effectively denied the dignity of a vast population of people, right? So that seal that says, the love of liberty brought us here. I'm actually quite appalled that we're still using that motto when a number of scholars, a number of activists, even before the TRC recommendation in 2009, where it said that symbol or that model should be the love of liberty united us here, because there were people here before the Black settlers came, before the free Blacks came from the Congo River Basin, before they came from the United States, before they came from the Caribbean, right? So if you say the love of liberty brought us here, what you're effectively saying is everybody, all the ethno-linguistic groups that were here before those settlers arrived, they do not matter. Right. And if you go back to my refrain of dignity must define us would tell us that that motto is obsolete and it must be changed. Because if we're thinking about building a new Liberia for all Liberians, an inclusive Liberia for all Liberians, then our motto, our symbols, our cultural artifacts must reflect that, the dignity of every single person in the country, right? So I think that's the premise from which I sort of posit that idea of changing the national symbols. But what I said was not new. There were Liberian scholars or Liberian kind of activists who said this much, much earlier than I did. And that's why I said I'm going to reiterate what people have already said. The conversation that was started a number of years ago. Let's go back to that conversation. In terms of the national language, many Liberians probably are not aware that most African countries have indigenous national languages. They may have a European language that they might use for commerce, right? So in so-called Francophone West Africa, they might use French for commerce, or in Anglophone West Africa, they might use English for commerce. But the national language, for instance, of Senegal is Wolof. The national language of, I believe, Ghana is Twi. Then, we have national languages. We don't even have to go far. Within the context of West Africa, we have countries that have experienced colonialism. We have not, that have experienced colonialism that still take a widely spoken language and use that as their national language. It's a way of unifying. It's a way of saying we were Africans before we were colonized. We were human before we were colonized, right? Now, as a country that has not been formally colonized, as it were, in terms of the European scramble for Africa, why is it that we can't take, for instance, a lot of people have sent me emails. So which language would you choose? Bassa? No, I wouldn't choose Bassa because that's what my family speaks. I wouldn't choose Kru because that's what my family speaks. What I would choose is something like Pele. Pele, for instance,
at the University of Liberia.
Widely spoken. And the people who are the cultural kind of practitioners can give advice about what language, what population, what portion of the population speaks Pele, for instance. Let's start teaching Pele in the schools. Let's start teaching, perhaps using Pele in legislative dialogues, right? Like maybe that's a tall order. That'll be something that happens long before you and I are on the face of this earth. But let's adopt the national language to say we are African. We were African before we were anything else, right? Even those who came from abroad, they were of African descent, right? So I think that's why I'm so that's why I'm so, passionate about this idea of a national language. This is why I'm so passionate about the idea of revisiting those cultural symbols, those cultural artifacts, because at the end of the day, culture is what makes you who you are. That idea of a nation, that culture is what builds a nation inside of a state, right? And if we've lost touch with that, if we can't even speak our local languages, then who are we really? What is our identity as Liberians? So it's a way to unify. It's a way to honor our ethno-linguistic history. It's a way to say we are going to ensure that not only are we fluent in Liberian English, because everybody speaks Liberian English, that's our lingua franca, right? But we're also fluent in Pele, for instance, right? For instance, I'm going to keep emphasizing for instance, because someone has to then do the research and determine the vast majority of people in Liberia speak language X, right? And then we can also be fluent in standard English. So we would be multilingual in our nationalism. And there's nothing more powerful than a nation that's multilingual. There's nothing more powerful than a nation that takes its sort of cultural lineage, such as a national language, and uses that, teaches that, holds that in high regard, decides that that is going to be a part of our identity, right? There's nothing more powerful than that. So that's why I'm so committed, and I think pushing the agenda that we take on these issues and take them very, very, very seriously, because that's how you build a nation. Right now, I'm not really sure that we've done that. I'm not sure that we've actually built a nation. We might have a state that we call Liberia, but I'm not convinced that we have a nation called Liberia.
Okay, now you're going to bring me to the next question. You talked about it, but maybe repeat it, then maybe it will sink in. Or for those who are online now, the difference between nation build. Did you say nation building or
State building?
nation building and state building? And then where did I have that? Hold on, please. Nation building and state building. Yeah. So the difference between nation building and state building and why both are crucial for Liberia's future. And
Sure.
how can we balance those two aspects effectively to ensure holistic development?
Sure. So that sort of dichotomy between nation building and state building is very foundational to my scholarly work. I talk about it a lot in my scholarly work. So that whole portion of the speech was based on the sort of scholarly analysis that I've conducted on the difference between nation building and state building. So when you think about state building, for instance, is about building institutions of government. So this is everything from reforming policies, the things that we talked about earlier, reforming policies to reforming how the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches of government function. And state building is institution centric. So that's what I talk about, institution centric, right? It's about institutions. Whereas nation building is people centric. It's really focused on the citizens themselves, right? Not necessarily the institutions. It also, in contrast to state building, is about building relationships. It's about building social cohesion. It's about ensuring that people, again, are respecting each other, respecting each other's differences. It's about psychosocial healing. It's about communal well-being. It's all of those things that make us feel human at the very, very basic level, right? That's what nation building is. The other difference between nation building and state building is nation building will always require national agency. It will always require national ownership, and it will always require national resources. No one can come and build your nation for you. You must do that on your own terms, with your own resources, and with your own kind of, plan and policies in place. State building, on the other hand, if you don't have sufficient resources, or if you don't have all the resources, then you might be able to rely on external resources, right? But still on your own terms. And we can get into the whole aid architecture, because I fundamentally believe that we should be talking about reparations and not aid. I am not a proponent of aid. I'm a proponent of reparations. But we can talk about that after this conversation, after this segment of the conversation, Priscilla. So that's essentially the difference between state building and nation building. So nation building is about building relationships. State building is about building institutions of government. And the reason you want to focus on state building and nation building at the same time is because when you prioritize state building and nation building, if you focus on state building, for instance, what that does is if you build institutions of government, then that enables the government to fulfill its responsibility to citizens, right? If you build, if you focus on policy reform, if you focus on ensuring that the institutions of government have the resources, they have the expertise to deliver public goods, to ensure that privileges and protections are extended to the citizenry, that's really, really important. If you also build the nation at the same time, what you're essentially doing is you're making sure that there is cohesion, there's a foundation of cohesion, such that institutions of government are able to build relationships with individuals and collectivities and communities, right? So there is that sort of tango between the citizens and their institutions of government, so that there is mutual accountability between citizens, but also between citizens and the state. That is a sort of holistic way of thinking about structural transformation. That's a holistic way of thinking about socioeconomic transformation, as it were, development in quotation marks. This is the foundation of my work as a critical development studies scholar. So that's the difference. I hope that's clarified it for people. I kind of alluded to it in the speech, but that's
Yeah.
a more fleshed out explanation of the difference between nation building and state building, and the sort of justification for why what I gave about why those two have to be pursued together. That you can't build a state without building a nation. You can't build a nation without building a state. And the two have to happen simultaneously, right? So if you focus on state building, what about the relationship between citizens and the relationship between the citizens and the state? You have sort of a vacuum there, and there's a gap. So the two must work. They must go together. They must absolutely go together.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let me read some comments. So Jackie says, please donate to focus on Liberia. We need academic discussions like these. Please donate, people. This is a Liberia initiative. Donate to focus on Liberia. We're doing community service. Let's build our own. Thank you, Jackie. And then let me read the second statement. I know it will be biased, but yeah, it's part of the first one. So the Cash App number is 651 39 26224. Cash App is 65139 26224. Donate to focus on Liberia, and it's $ FOL Media.
This is the way you build the nation by donating
Yeah,
to
let's
focus on
donate
Liberia.
to focus on Liberia. Yeah, we need a kind of conversation. Look, at all of you want your comments to be read. So let's build our own thing. So that we can continue to have these kind of conversations. So yes, the number, I'm going to leave it on here. Let's go to two more questions, then we'll go back to more comments. So your recommendations for leadership and citizen participation in nation building. Before I ask you about the IMF, please just do this one.
Sure.
The key reforms for leadership and governance to ensure constant transparency and accountability. What are your critical recommendations for President Joseph Boyka and other leaders to achieve tangible goals in the next 6 years? What key reforms do you believe President Boyka should focus on to cement his legacy as a respected statesman?
Yeah. I started talking about those suggestions. I didn't go into very, very much detail.
Mhm.
So the first thing I advised was, and the appointments process is kind of long far gone, but as someone used to say, you can appoint somebody, but you can also disappoint somebody. So like you can appoint, but you can also disappoint. So just because somebody's appointed early days doesn't mean you can't fire them. The Kenyan president, William Ruto, just completely reconfigured his entire cabinet. Other heads of state have done it before. So if the person doesn't deliver, if the president doesn't perform, you can disappoint them just as you've appointed them. So one of the recommendations I made to President Boyka in the speech was, nationally representative body of government in the executive. What you have the control over is to appoint a lot of people, right? So do your due diligence, investigate these people. What is their track record in terms of public service? What is their track record if they worked in the private sector? Were they dubious? Did they crook people? Did they steal from people? Were they thieves? Those are not the people you want to appoint. You want to appoint people who have the competence. Number one, they have the intellectual capacity to do the work. Secondly, they have the integrity, right? Sometimes you can't really tell that somebody has integrity until you put them in a position of trust. But if they evade that public trust, then the onus is on you as a head of state to disappoint them, right? To fire them. And more than fire them, if they've been caught stealing state resources, make sure that they're prosecuted. And if they are found guilty, because everybody is innocent until found guilty, if they're found guilty, force them to restitute funds and send them to jail. Make them an example, right? So that anybody else who follows, who comes after them will know that you mean business, not business as usual. So I think that's one of the ways. So the appointments process is such a powerful tool that the president can use to demonstrate to the public that he's really serious, right? Another way is come up with a development plan, and they're trying to do that with the so-called arrest agenda. Come up with a development plan that's feasible. Right now, I'm very concerned that the arrest agenda is a wish list of development goals. So we want to do so much in 6 years, and that's virtually impossible. So if you say you are an expert in agriculture and you say, I'm just going to focus on agriculture and roads in the next 6 years, Liberian people will respect you for that because you're not trying to tackle everything, right? So figure out what are the 3 key priorities. I think those 5, ARREST, the 6 priorities are a bit too much. There's only so much you can do in 6 years, and work under the assumption that you're only in office for 6 years. Because if you work under that assumption, you will be very, very cognizant of your legacy.
Yeah.
Right. So you're thinking about legacy. This is how much I'm able to achieve in 6 years. I'm not thinking about re-election. This is what I want to do in 6 years. And you tell the Liberian people, this is the plan. Right. So I would say the arrest agenda, it's a very lofty kind of government or national development plan. I think it entails too much. Right. That would be my kind of caution. I think it's bold that they want to achieve all of these things. But for me, it's not feasible. As someone who studies development policy making within the context of development, 6 years is not a long time at all. It's actually quite short, right? But do it in such a way that it holds posterity, right? So that the next person who comes can just take that torch that you started and continue, so that there's some sort of continuity. So those are some of the examples that I gave. The other thing that President Boyka, I think, should focus on is each ministry and agency, because as a head of state, you can't be everywhere. So if you put people who are competent and have integrity in positions of power, then you allow them, you don't micromanage them, you allow them to do their job. And then all you do is provide oversight. And if they're not doing their job, then you disappoint them, you get rid of them. But in the process of doing that, I think one of the things that he can do is sit with each of his ministers, sit with all of the heads of state-owned enterprises that he's appointed and say, I want to see your KPIs. What are your key performance indicators? And come up with those with these appointees to say, in 6 months, this is what I want to achieve. In a year, this is what I want to achieve. In 2 years, this is what I want to achieve. And then you have concrete deliverables that these people are supposed to produce. And if they're not producing, then that's grounds for firing. That's grounds for disappointing. That's grounds for tendering your resignation. So I think those are the sorts of concrete recommendations that I made to the head of state in terms of real kind of radical reform, in terms of cementing his legacy as a statesman, because I think a lot of people do have expectations of President Boyka, and I think duly so. I think they should, because there were certain things that campaign promised, this idea of rescuing, that I would like to see taken seriously. Now that you're in power, what are you going to do with those expectations? What are you going to do with the faith and confidence that the electorate has placed in you? And not just those who elected you, but those who didn't elect you, right? So how are you going to be a head of state for the entire country? How are you going to help build a nation for the entire country, and not just those who may have been partisan or those who were supportive of you during the electoral cycle?
Okay. All right. So now let's come to global perspective vis-a-vis autonomy. So how can we navigate international relationships while fostering internal social economic growth? I don't want to assume. So, is it safe to say you kind of have distrust, or you don't really trust the IMF and World Bank. And I've heard you express your reservation about these institutions in multiple uh, um,
Long before July 26, 2024.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. And even the Ebola time
Mm.
when I just did my presentation at the ASU, and then somebody sent that to me because it was similar way approach that I had in
Yeah.
my in my presentation. Then someone sent your clip to me, and I was like, "Oh my God, thank God there's a Liberian somewhere." So I'm not the only one being crazy. Yeah, but mine was mainly about the media frenzy, about the way they were under reporting,
Yeah.
how Liberians, Sierra Leoneans, and Guineans were combating the Ebola and using local resources and limited resources. But then they were there hailing this one doctor who came, like he saved the entire continent.
Mm, mm.
Um,
No,
who they
Liberians, Guineans, and Sierra Leoneans saved themselves. Nobody
Yeah,
saved us. We saved ourselves. And I
yeah,
said this in my speech. I said that
yeah,
was the moment when we saw an existential threat, an external existential threat, and we unified. That was the first time where we saw something outside of ourselves to attack. Right, where we didn't attack each other, we attacked something that was outside of ourselves, and we unified. That was such an important moment. I didn't have a chance to go into it in a lot of detail, but I talk about it in my scholarly work. Right,
yeah.
yeah,
That
the
was the first
international.
time I heard about. That was the first time I heard you talk to those ladies in the studio about, hey, if you want change, then advocate for structural change.
Yeah,
So with the IMF about the UK government policy in those institutions. So how
sure.
should Liberia so just to say, you've been talking about this issue even before the July 26th, and I've heard you talk about it. Now, my question is, how should Liberia navigate its relationship with international institutions like the World Bank and IMF while ensuring internally driven social economic transformation?
Yeah, and I focused a lot on that, right? So the priorities that we set must be our own priorities. So we shouldn't pander to these institutions because they were not established to really help us. They were not established for the sort of radical socioeconomic transformation that I was talking about in my speech. In fact, these institutions were established in the mid 19th century or the mid 1900s to rebuild Europe after World War II. So let's remember that their foundation, their historical foundation, was never to build Africa, was never to build Liberia, was never to transform Liberia, was never to create any sort of structural transformation. And if we remember their history, then we'll say, okay, the way that we deal with them, the way that we interact with them, the way that we interface with them must be very, very different. So I would say, first and foremost, for people who are not aware of my work, who are not aware of my scholarship as well as my activism, I am staunchly opposed to the aid industry. I think it's a business. I think these institutions create mechanisms to ensure that countries like Liberia continue to rely on them. And they do this through loan systems, through loan architecture, through aid architecture, grants, whatever you might want to call it, external expertise who might parachute in and do a sort of copy and paste. Oh, this worked in East Timor, therefore it must work in Liberia, right? That's their whole system. That's their whole modus operandi. And
Hmm.
they were set up so that, for people who are not aware, structural adjustment policies were intended to restructure the economies of countries in the so-called global south. And I'm talking about countries in Africa, countries in Asia, as well as countries in Latin America, so that they could become credit worthy. So it's a very capitalist kind of neocolonial, I was going to say neoliberal way of operating, right? They were not set up, these structural adjustment policies were not about transforming economies to ensure that countries were able to meet basic social services, were able to provide basic social services to their citizenry. In fact, these structural adjustment policies that still exist today under the guise of poverty reduction strategies, these structural adjustment policies that are now adjustment policies with a human face, i.e. PRSs, the first thing that they will do, as they've done in the past, is when you have to focus on macroeconomic stability, right? They'll focus on privatization. And we all know what happens when a country privatizes. The vast majority of people who can't afford private services will be left out, right? Privatization, you have to deregulate, right? So you allow the private sector, international global capital to come in. and provide some sort of competition to your domestic private sector that creates all kinds of inequalities, right? So deregulate, privatize, and liberalize. Those are the three that's the triad of these IMF and World Bank institutions. Again, not interested in structural transformation for the sake of transforming systems that will help citizens. The other thing they might do is they might say, oh, we'll give you a loan. And with that loan, there are conditions to the loan, right? So those conditions to the loan will be privatize, deregulate, liberalize. The other conditions of these loans, or external expertise, or whatever it might come in terms of the form, will also be you have to cut social services. That is a criteria. That is what you call a conditionality, right? And it's not just the IMF and the World Bank who will set these conditions. It's also internet or aid agencies that represent states, right? So country X will come in and say, we're going to give you X in conditions, and this is the condition you must meet, right? So in the context of the World Bank and the IMF, they'll say you have to cut social services, right? So you cut social services. What's the first thing to go? Health. Investments in health will go. Investments in education will go. Where does that leave the vast majority of your citizenry when investments in health and investments in social services such as education are completely cut, right? So if you think about how these institutions operate, they are neoliberal. They are not intended for any sort of radical socioeconomic transformation. And what I said in my speech was, do not blindly pander to their policies. So you can deal with the IMF and the World Bank on your own terms. And you can say, as a member state of the World Bank, as a member state of the IMF, these are the kinds of resources that I require, whether they're concessional loans. The other thing about these sort of aid mechanisms is people assume that these are grants. Most of these institutions are giving us loans that we have to pay back with high levels of interest. So I always tell my students, my policy students at the LSE who are development, the next generation of development practitioners, that there's a myth within the public discourse that a lot of African countries are debt distressed because they borrow exponentially. That is not the truth. The truth is, the reason why a lot of countries in Africa are debt distressed is because their levels of interest, the high interest rates that they have to pay, are astronomically more than countries in other parts of the globe, right? So it's not that African countries borrow more than other countries, it's that their interest rates are always higher, right? That, for me, is a structural violence. That, for me, is a form of international inequality, right? And there are even countries in Africa, as a part of the AU kind of superstructure, which are pushing the international financial architecture, the international financial institution, to be fair to African countries in terms of taxes, right? Why are we paying high levels of interest when we need the resources to provide basic social services to our citizenry? So that, for me, is inherently unequal, right? So that's the IMF and the World Bank. Now, I've been hearing a lot of hearsay, or maybe it's not hearsay, but a lot of interesting politicking that's happening on the side of some countries where they'll say, oh, we gave you 163 million every year, right? We give you 163 million every year. So if a country says this, the first thing you want to ask them, and this is an exercise that I do with my students, because as I mentioned earlier, I am not a proponent of aid. There's a scholar by the name of Ilhan Kapoor, right, who argues that aid is fraudulent kindliness. And what he means by fraudulent kindliness is, I'll give you 163 million a year, but what am I taking in return? Right? I'm insisting that certain resources are extracted at very, very low taxes, or I'm insisting that the companies from my country are exempted from any sort of taxes. So there's always something. Whoever is a so-called financial or a foreign financier, I don't even call them donors, because as far as I'm concerned, they're not donating anything. They're always getting more in return than they give. So that is a fact. Anybody who does development research, anybody who is a development practitioner knows that. It's a hidden secret from a lot of people who are not au courant with the system, but I am. I've worked in the system, and I've also studied the system, and I've researched the system, and I've published about the system. So I'm saying this for all the people who have something to say about certain statements that I made during the national oration. I'm going to educate you. And then when I'm done educating you, go and read my research. Go and read the research of Ilhan Kapoor, who said that aid is fraudulent kindliness, right? So aid is very opaque. It's deliberately opaque because the so-called foreign financiers, the so-called donors, who I don't call donors, I call them foreign financiers, because they're always getting more. They're always getting more than the people that they give so-called aid to. First of all, They're always getting more. And then secondly, important to remember is if that 163 million comes into country X, Liberia, for instance, 163 million is not going through the national budget. First of all, probably 50% of that 163 million that so-called is donated to Liberia stays in country X through admin, overhead, right? It doesn't even move from the shores of country X. Secondly, what country X will do is country X will take a portion of that 163 million and they will channel that money through international partners. For instance, the UN. They're not giving it to your country. They're not giving it to Liberia, right? It's being channeled elsewhere through international partners. Then if they may give maybe 2% of that 163 million to your national government through budget support, right? And that 2% that they might donate through budget support has conditions. It has conditions. You must do X, Y, and Z. A portion of that 2% that is channeled through national budgets, for instance, you have to use a procurement process where you procure goods and services from that country X, that same so-called foreign financier, that same so-called donor. So at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, the whole thing is a racket. It's a scam. It is fraudulent kindliness. And if anybody wants to do their due diligence, go and do research on aid. It's serious. It's seriously a problem because I think a lot of people assume that the money is going straight to the government and the government is chopping it. That is not what's happening. Most of aid is severely, intensely monitored. So it's virtually impossible for governments to chop the money because it's so severely monitored. There's so many conditions on it. You have to jump through so many hoops to get that small 2% of the 163 million that at the end of the day, most of the money that is supported through budget support, that's what gets Liberia, that's what moves Liberia support forward, right? So any aid that's coming through, in fact, when I was in government, one of the things that I used to say to the government is, let's stop announcing these huge figures that aid industries or aid representatives keep telling us, oh, we give you 163 million. You know what I said to the government? I said, let's start announcing dispersals. So out of that 163 million, Liberia got X through budget support. This is how much money that was actually channeled through our national government. That's what we need to be announcing, not those huge figures, half of which don't even reach our shores, half of which are channeled through international implementing partners, half of which we don't even see until 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years later, a small portion of which that we actually use for budget support that is intensely monitored, right? That we cannot just use willy-nilly. We cannot just use without any sort of accountability. And that we have no control over in terms of the conditions that are set that we have to meet, right? So cutting basic social services might be a condition that we have to meet. So I think people need to just be very vigilant in terms of how they monitor the aid industry, because at the end of the day, it is a business. It always serves the interests of the so-called donor. It always serves the interests of the so-called foreign financier significantly more than it does the so-called recipient of that aid. And once we disabuse ourselves of the sort of intention of aid, as well as the impact of aid, then we can move forward and talk about something that's more important, such as how do we generate domestic resource mobilization so that we're not reliant on a country X, so that we're not reliant on the IMF and the World Bank, right? That's how we stand on our own 2 feet and do the work of nation building, do the work of state building without necessarily having to blindly pander to these institutions. So I'm sorry I had to stand on my soapbox. It's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. It's something that by the time my students, because I teach a course for undergrads as well as postgrads called Development and Social Change. And this particular undergraduate module is 2 terms, right? So it's 2 semesters. By the time my students come into my class and leave my class, they are so vigilant, right? So if somebody says, oh, we gave country X 163 million, the first thing they're going to ask is, where did that money go? How was it channeled? Was it in the form of a loan? Was it in the form of a concessional loan? Was it in the form of grant? Did it go through the national budget? What percentage of that national budget did that aid get channeled through, right? So these are the kinds of vigilant questions that I would ask Liberian people to start asking or, demanding. And then essentially just do your research. Google is there. Any information you want is online. The other thing about the aid industry, or the aid business is what I call it, is that it's deliberately opaque. A lot of these aid agencies will not want to be transparent about how the money is used because they want to seem as if they're altruistic. They are not altruistic. They are not humanitarian. They are strategic. That money is strategic. That aid is strategic, and it always serves their interest. more than it does the so-called recipient of that so-called aid. So I'm going to end there and just say, this is why I'm a huge proponent of reparations. I am not a proponent of aid because I think aid is a business, and it's been proven that it's a business, and it's been proven by scholars galore, such as Ilan Kapoor, that it is fraudulent kindliness. It's a pretense. It's a sort of pretense to say that an aid so-called donor or an aid foreign financier is giving because they love a particular country, such as Liberia, that they love a country so much that they're being humanitarian or altruistic. No, they are getting more, and they will always get more than the so-called recipient. Always.
Yeah. I think people who either don't understand where you're coming from or are shocked with some of these revelations are people who also may not be following other scholars, human rights activists, uh, on the situation with aid, um, or
Sorry, I
donor.
forgot to say that a lot of countries that provide aid or foreign financiers will
Mhm.
also insist that their domestic private sector come into your country and compete and extract resources. Right? That might be a condition. That might be a condition of the so-called aid. Right? So once we start unpacking and investigating and really doing our due diligence, we'll realize that it's a racket, it's a farce, it's a scam. Aid is a scam.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's what it is. Maybe some of our people, they think you are from Mars or you are from space. They may not be aware that other people in other countries are awakening, speaking up like you are against these kind of things.
Yeah, and
You
there's a
mentioned.
way there's a way for our government to negotiate, right? So my sort of my my challenge to the government of Liberia is, it's not to say that you don't deal with foreign financiers. It's not to say that you don't deal with the IMF and the World Bank, but you make your intentions clear, and you say, these conditions we will not accept. These are our priorities. This is how we get from point A to point Z. This is what we require. This is what we can do in return. And the negotiation process should be one that we put country first. The negotiation process should be that we don't just accept any condition, we don't just accept any terms. And the negotiation process should be such that the citizens, their well-being is front and center. Again, dignity must define us, and it also must define how we negotiate with these foreign financiers. It must define how we negotiate with the IMF and the World Bank. It must define how we negotiate with our so-called aid partners, right? It must be front and center. Our dignity must be front and center. And the onus then comes back to us is, how do we generate our own domestic resources such that that relationship with the World Bank and the IMF, and that relationship with all these other kind of foreign financiers, becomes so obsolete, becomes so insignificant that we don't need them. That's where I would like to see Liberia go. That's, for me, that is what a reimagined Liberia looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was just saying that there are other activists like Robtel that are out there speaking against the same thing when it comes to the country. She mentioned Haiti when we started, which most of us know as Haiti. There is this human right Asian human right lawyer who I had invited some
Mm-hmm.
months ago, and we're trying to sort out when she comes on. But was part of the decision to sue to block the U.S. backed deployment of
Mm.
humanitarian effort to Haiti. And she was like, no, the last time they were there after they left, the UN left, they due to rape, domestic,
Yeah. Cholera, the
violence
huge
against
cholera
women, all of that.
outbreak. Yeah.
They left, yeah, and then whole population of children without, fathers, and they left that. So these kind of things have a huge social implications that we don't even consider.
Yeah.
And so she's one of the very outspoken uh, um, Haitian in the diaspora
Yeah.
about Haiti receiving aid, quote unquote, aid from, from international community. So hopefully we will have our own soon. But I just wanted to add to that point you were making. So yeah. So lastly, um, you talk about focusing on local creativity as
Mhm.
opposed to um, in focusing on the extractive industry, if I got you
Yeah.
right. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure, sure. So, the extractives industry or the extractive industries, for people who are not familiar with that, it's basically taking natural resources, things that come from the ground, things that you produce kind of naturally. So things like iron ore. These are finite resources, which mean that they're not going to exist forever and ever. Amen. So you take those resources, you take your rubber, you take your raw latex, you take your gold, you take your diamonds, you take your iron ore, you take your timber, and you don't do anything with it. You just extract and then you export, right? And then those same materials come back to you manufactured. So your timber becomes
If you
furniture.
buy
Your
it.
iron ore becomes steel rods. For instance, many people are building in Liberia, right? You use steel rods. Your gold becomes, the engagement rings that we all see people wearing, right? Flashing on Facebook and social media. Your textile or your cotton then becomes finished textiles. Your cocoa, or sorry, your cocoa becomes chocolate, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. That's what I mean by extractives. You take what you have in terms of raw resources, you extract it from the country, you export it, you send it out, and then it comes back to you where you have to pay a premium on it, significant amounts of money, right?
And yeah,
Yeah, and you're losing because you're extracting and exporting. You're losing twofold. You're extracting and you're exporting, and then you're losing because it's coming back to you in a manufactured way. So what I said was we need to build a manufacturing base where we are exporting steel rods, where we are exporting condoms. And condoms, you can make so much money from exporting condoms. The amount of raw latex we have in Liberia is it's beyond me, right? Mind blowing. We are exporting, finished furniture, and that's where you get the artisans in, where we got so many talented people who can make furniture out of the timber that we export. You are taking Liberian country cloth made from our own kind of intricately woven cloth and making it into the beautiful outfit that I made. I mean, that I wore on July 26th. So a lot of people were joking and say, but what she keep fanning herself for? It was hot and I was wearing country cloth. So one of the things that I've told to people who are designers or textile makers is, how do we make the country, because it's beautiful, right? Beautifully woven. But how do we make the country cloth a little bit thinner such that you can wear it during the summer months, so you can wear it during dry season, so you can wear it in our humid temperature in Liberia, right? So that's one of the ways. If you focus on the creative industries where you're building, first of all, you're building a manufacturing base, but then also looking at our creative industry. So people who are artisans, people who are furniture makers, people who are dancers, people who are filmmakers, people who are writers. If you invest in our cultural industries, that can be a way of generating domestic resource mobilization, right? If you invest in these people in such a way that they become cultural exporters, right? You know how Nollywood has become so popular across the continent, right? That is a cultural artifact of Nigeria, right? The same goes for the food that we make, right? People who are culinary artists. That's a form of the sort of creative industries that I would like to see us focus on, because a lot of a lot of creatives in Liberia are barely making ends, right? And at the end of the day, if we decide to put together a time capsule of the next 177 years, and we put whatever we want to put in that time capsules, the people who will be opening that time capsule in 177 years are going to ask, who were your novelists in 2024?
mm,
Who were your dancers? Who were your dramatists? Who were your cultural artisans? Who were your culinary artists? They're not necessarily going to ask you who was your politician X in the legislature in 2024. They would care less, because these people are the people who are the custodians of our culture.
Yep.
Because I said culture is fluid. It is not fixed. It's constantly evolving. So we need to ensure that we protect and invest in these people, because not only can we make money off of them, but we can also preserve our culture. We can protect our culture. So I think that's why I wanted to focus on that as a part of the oration, because I think it often gets neglected at the expense of, oh, let's extract and export. Let's extract and export. I think we focus on that too much. If you're building a manufacturing base, that also has to factor in the cultural and creative industries. It's very, very, very key. You go back to that idea of nation building. This is how you build a nation. When you preserve and protect your cultural and creative artists, that's a way of building the nation as well.
Oh my God, Robtel, just like when you're in church, for those who, when you're in church, you go like, preach, pastor, you just, yeah, all day you just, talk to my soul sister. So yeah, I could just go on and on.
Sure.
But out of respect for your time and the audience, we're
Sure.
going almost 2 hours.
It's okay. We can end at exactly 2 hours. That's fine. I
Yeah.
can give you another 6 minutes.
Yeah. So I mean, I just wanted to agree with the last point you made about extracting our resources and then exporting it, then they come back to us and we pay so high on it. I have this South African scholar mentor. She wanted to come on today, and I'm like, no, I need to have her hotel. So she might come on next Sunday or the Sunday after, another fire lady. But she says stuff like that. She's like, I don't wear gold. I say in South Africa, I'm never going to wear gold until South Africans are being paid for the gold. I'm not going to. Yeah. And then the other thing she would say, like the same way, how does it make sense that Starbucks made more money from the coffee we produce?
Yeah.
The coffee
And
that
I don't know if people knew, but in like the 19th and earlier 20th century, we had something called Liberica. It was a type of coffee that we actually produced. And it was really, 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 well received internationally. I'd like to see us. I know there's some people who are now thinking about investing in coffee production in Liberia, and more than just consumption for the sort of international market, but thinking about how do you export coffee within the continent of Africa. Africa has this African free trade agreement, the AFCFTA, that the African Union has been pushing. So it's more than just extracting and exporting. It's about building a manufacturing base so that we can export to our neighbors. What is our comparative advantage in Liberia? Liberica, the coffee, right? There's so many ways to produce revenue for. That's why I kept saying throughout my speech, Priscilla, we have all the resources we need, human as well as financial. We do. It's just a matter of thinking outside of the box, thinking innovatively, to get the money and the resources that we require to do the work of structural transformation, to do the work of state building, to do the work of nation building, because it is very possible on our own terms and with our own resources.
It is. Thank you so much, Robtel. If there is something that I didn't touch on, please go ahead and just send us home so that I can close us.
So I would say we kind of.
And sorry, people, there's no time to read all of these comments, please.
Well, it's good. It's good. No problem. It's good that it's generating a conversation. I hope someone asked me if I feel like I shocked the nation on July 26, 2024. And the speech was intended, as I said from the very beginning, to incite and inspire change. And I think I did incite and inspire change. And the conversation, I think, is ongoing, where people are still talking about the speech and they've gotten over the distraction. And now they're going to the nitty gritty of the detailed nuances of what I said. I mean, I was just watching a LinkedIn, I forget the people who did the analysis, but I was watching a LinkedIn podcast of the speech where these two Liberian pastors based in the United States went line by line. And I was saying to them, kind of out, in my flat by myself in London, I said, this is the kind of analysis I expected the media to do, right? Go line by line, do the analysis, the deep dive that I expected the media to do. But it's okay, since the media has not fulfilled its function. Liberian civil society is doing the work, and
Yeah, we're
you
doing
are
it.
doing the work. You are
Yeah.
doing the work by inviting me to this speech. So I would say, or to this conversation. So I would say, for anybody who wants to number one, access the speech, it's on the executive
I have
management
it there.
website.
Yeah, it's right
It's on
here.
my personal website. Everything is there. The speech, if you don't want to read the speech, because I know it's very long, if you look at it, it's kind of like an eyesore. I get it. If you don't want to read the speech, you can listen to the speech. You can watch the video of the speech. It's accessible. I would say listen to it, read it, dissect it, debate it, critique it. And this is the thing. Go ahead and critique it. I don't expect people to agree with everything that I said, but take the speech in its entirety. Right? Take the speech in its entirety and have a conversation about that speech in its entirety. And then that kind of constructive criticism, I am more than open to, right? But not people who just look at 4 lines and that's what they want to harp on. I think that, yeah, go back to the speech, have a conversation about it. Go to the Aitai shops, have a conversation about it. Go to your community meetings, have a conversation about it. The legislature, I'm hoping, is having a conversation about it because I had a lot of things to say to them. I had a lot of recommendations for them. Hopefully the executive is having a conversation about it. But Liberians, that speech was for Liberians. It wasn't just for the government. And it's funny because, I mean, I'll end soon, but Priscilla, one of the things that I found so funny before I delivered the speech, people kept saying to me, yeah, I know you're going to deal with the government in your speech. And I just started laughing. I said, but they don't know what is coming. I'm coming for everybody. Nobody is exempt from this particular speech, right? And everybody felt like they were reflected. Everybody was reflected in the speech. And that was intentional. Because as far as I'm concerned, the work of state building, the work of nation building is for all of us. It's for all of us. And in order for dignity to define us, in order for Independence Day to become Indefiance Day, we all have to be accountable, not only to ourselves, but each other and the nation that we call Liberia that we love so much. If you love a country so much, not only do you reserve the right to critique it because you love it and you want it to be better, but you also have a responsibility to change it in your lifetime. And so for me, the responsibility rests on our shoulders. And to demystify people who lodge critiques at me, having not read the speech, that entire speech, the kernel of that speech, the crux of that speech was about accountability, Liberians' accountability to themselves and Liberians' accountability to the nation. Right? That was what that entire speech was about. And when I said dignity must define us, I was speaking collectively. So those are my final words. And I hope that refrain, dignity must define us, becomes our clarion call. It becomes our prayer. It becomes our North Star. It becomes our unifying central ideal as a people. Dignity must define us.
Define us. Dignity must define us. Robtel, you know, when you said they were like, you must deal with them. It just reminds, and even after you, and yeah, after you deliver, still people didn't get that. Oh, this thing was talking about us. It reminds me of the story about the man who always went to church and be like, tell them, Pastor, and the pastor is talking to him for something
about you.
Yeah. So this day he goes to church and it rained. No one showed up. He showed up, and the pastor stood up and said and preach and said, "Thank God I had the opportunity." Saying he's the only one here. And pastor preached, and at the end of the service, he said, "Good message, Pastor. I wish they were here today."
Well, you know, Priscilla, I'm really glad you ended on that note, because if people were really listening to the speech, it's not in the written text, but I don't know, when I got up on stage, the first thing I thought about was that incantation to God. So the first thing I said after I thanked the young woman, the young girl who introduced me, I said, "May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my redeemer." Because as far as I was concerned, this was a message from God to the people, and I was a mere vessel, right? So in many respects, all the critique, whether it's founded or unfounded, like I said, I'm just brushing it off my shoulders, because as far as I'm concerned, I was a vessel for God. I fear no mortal, no man. The only entity that I fear is God. And if God was speaking to me, to the nation, if God was speaking through me to Liberia, whose critique really matters to me? Nobody's, right? Dignity must define us.
Man.
Dignity must define us.
Inshallah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sister.
You're
So
welcome.
people, yeah, no, honestly, thank you. People, yes, it please donate to Focus on Liberia. Donate so that we can continue these kind of programs. Thank you, Jackie. This was necessary. I don't know why I've never thought of it, but thanks, Jackie. And the cash app number is 651-392-6224. So thanks to Robtel for being so gracious to come on a new day today to spend 2 hours something with us. Thank you, Robtel, and thanks to our viewers for joining us as well. Thank you for your participation. I see the comments is so active, and I appreciate that. Honestly, it's just that we don't have the time to read, because if I have to read and then Robtel has to comment to all of them, we must spend 4 hours, and we have another program coming on soon.
Yeah.
So thank you all for joining us today. And remember, on a new day, we say change begins with a conversation. Therefore, let's continue the dialogue. Let's elevate our voices and actively participate in shaping a world where social justice isn't only an aspiration, but a reality. Join us next time on our New Day Conversations as we continue to explore and advocate for social reform. Let's make every day a new day for progress. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. I wish all Liberians an awakened consciousness of defiance henceforth, and to remember Robtel called to us. Let dignity define us. Let dignity define us, Liberians. It's a new day, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you, Robtel.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Priscilla. Thank you again for the invitation.
Sure.
Bye
Okay.
bye.
Bye.
Our country, sweet Priscilla, our country, that God gave us this country. Tell Labyrinth, that God gave us this country. We are calling on everyone here to come and pray for this country, Labyrinth, Labyrinth.